or good morning, depending on your time zone. My name is Joe Haynes. I'm going to be hosting this evening's webinar, excuse me, which is on the escalation, continued escalation of Israeli state aggression against the Palestinian people, with a particular focus on the media, the international media, and its silences, its selective reporting, its now familiar use of the passive voice when reporting on the colonization of Palestine. There's an incredible panel of speakers tonight. I will restrict my introduction to simply mentioning the last round of the shelling of Gaza earlier in August, which resulted in the deaths of, I believe, 44 Palestinians, including 15 children, and the assassination of a number of political figures. Of course, one can't mention the media Palestine without thinking of Shireen Abu Akleh and her assassination in late June of this year. Her killing is part of what I believe is best described as a systematic denial, crushing of Palestinian journalists' rights and indeed lives. And it's with that in mind that I think we should discuss the press and reporting on the continued colonization of Palestine. I'll leave it there. We have, I believe, 8 speakers. If I can ask each of them to try and keep it to around 10 minutes. I'll not wearing a watch, but you'll understand this gesture as you near those 10 minutes. And to, as briefly as possible, introduce each speaker in turn in the order in which they'll speak. Stanley Michael Link is a professor of the University of Western Ontario and a special reporter on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967. Phyllis Bennis is director of the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. Adam Shapiro is head of communications and visibility for the Ireland-based international human rights organization Frontline Defenders. Jim Moran is a former representative for Virginia's 8th District. Sarah Flanders is an American political writer and a member of the Secretariat of the Workers' World Party. Pauline Mary McNeill is a member of the Scottish Parliament for Scottish Labour for the Glasgow region. Nadine Sanders is a broadcaster and correspondent for AP and International Voice News. And finally, Khalid Tourani is the chairman of the international platform of NGOs working for Palestine. I will remind speakers of their turn in the sequence, if that would help. And if I can invite Stanley to speak first. Stanley, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate being asked to speak on this topic. It's an important one. I'm also appreciative of the of the panel that you've assembled for this, and it's an honor to be asked. I am, as Joe has mentioned, actually the former UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territory. I served between 2016 and the end of April 2022. Perhaps if I'm going first, I can just give an overview with respect to what has been going on recently in both Gaza and the West Bank, and East Jerusalem with respect to violence against Palestinians. And then I want to just briefly comment with respect to an issue that I've often spoken about when I was the Special Rapporteur, which is the accountability or the lack of accountability that the international community should be imposing upon Israel with respect to the conduct of its occupation. There were news reports that were issued in the last day or so said that the death rate on Palestinians in the West Bank is the highest since 2016. At least 85 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank so far this year. This includes a number of Palestinians. You've mentioned the name, obviously, of Shireen Abu Akleh, who was killed at the beginning of May, almost certainly by Israeli gunfire when she was covering an Israeli military raid on the northern West Bank city of Jenin. There was also another, she was a Palestinian American, and there also was another Palestinian American who was killed, Omar Assad, a 78-year-old man who was coming back from a card game. He was blindfolded, arrested, and left out in the January cold and died under those circumstances. What I want to be able to say clearly with respect to both the West Bank and also with respect to Gaza, and particularly the 49 Palestinians who were killed last month during the brief assault by Israeli military, is that the Israeli occupation is requiring more and more violence and more coercion, including more deadly violence, in order to be able to maintain its rule. That's the, I guess, the key lesson that I take out of the trends over the past while. There's been a growing number of deaths of Palestinians. There are more administrative detainees than there have been for a number of years. There's now more than 600 Palestinians are under administrative detention, which is a form of imprisonment that is very strictly regulated under international law, which the Israelis have used with great abuse over the decades. There is more settler violence than there has been in a number of years with respect to attacks by Israeli settlers in the West Bank. There's been more home demolitions than there has been in a number of years between 2021 and 2022 than there have been in a number of years as well. This indicates to me that there's a growing restiveness in the occupied Palestinian territory against the multiple abuses of the Israeli occupation. It also indicates to me that the hold on power by the Palestinian Authority is becoming more and more shaky, as well as the the security relationship between Israel and the Palestinian Authority has become more and more fractured. The point I guess I want to be able to make, and what I think I can bring to this, is just a comment with respect to international law. We should all remember that international law contains strict prohibitions respecting the use of live fire on unarmed civilian demonstrators, most of which the dead and wounded, many of the dead and wounded appear to have been. The basic principles on the use of force and firearm by law enforcement officials, which the UN created in 1990, requires the armed agents of the state to refrain from using excessive and lethal force on civilians unless their own lives and their own safety is in actual danger. So what do I mean when I talk about accountability and the prevailing Israeli impunity for its conduct of the occupation? There is no occupation in the modern world that has been conducted with the international community so alert to the many grave breaches of international law, so knowledgeable about the occupier's obvious and well-signaled intent to annex and to establish permanent sovereignty, so well informed about the scale of suffering and dispossession endured by the protected population under occupation, and yet so unwilling to act upon the overwhelming evidence before it to employ the tangible and plentiful legal and political tools at the disposal of the international community to end this injustice. An international community which took its legal responsibilities to challenge and to end international wrongful acts seriously would have long ago concluded that Israel, the occupying power, was not sincere about wanting to end the occupation. the international community would understand from the glaring examples of what is going on in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, that muffled protests and meek criticisms by international diplomats are not changing the harsh reality on the ground. The international community that had taken its responsibility seriously would have drawn the necessary lessons from the many unfulfilled Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, the inordinate length of the occupation, the innumerable facts on the ground, and the endless rounds of negotiations. Such an international community would take the prudent and necessary steps to collectively construct a list of effective countermeasures which be appropriate and proportional to circumstances to bring this occupation to an end. Such an international community would realize that bold measures and the determination to enforce accountability in these circumstances would greatly improve the chances that the next obstinate occupier would not likely want to test the resolve of the international community. All this tells us that accountability must rise to the very top of the international political agenda, respecting the illegal Israeli occupation of Palestine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a perfect introduction to this evening's discussion. So thank you. Phyllis, after you.
Thanks very much, Joe, and thanks, Michael, for a very good introduction. You know, the legacy of Israeli violence has a very long history, going back to the origins of illegal settlement in Palestine, the Nakba, the catastrophe that led to the expulsion and loss of homes for 750 million Palestinians in 1947 and 48, in which violence was regularly used to terrorize the population, leading to ethnic cleansing, very similar to that of other settler colonial realities in the world, including the United States, including the genocide against the indigenous population of this country before it was this country, and the continuing violence, the continuing Nakba, if you will. In Gaza, certainly, the consistent small-scale wars, if viewed from the Israeli vantage point, which end up over the years killing thousands, injuring tens of thousands, massive destruction of the infrastructure of the Gaza Strip, from Operation Cast Lead in 2008 and 9, in 2012, 2014, with over 2,200 Palestinians killed that time, 2018, last year in 2021, and then of course just last month, without rebuilding the infrastructure, meaning no access to sufficient clean water, sufficient electricity, the hospital is unable to function. And the Israeli description of that is mowing the grass, the occasional need for wiping out generations of Palestinians to suppress all possibility of nonviolent resistance or any other kind. In the West Bank, the consistent reliance on house demolitions, on raids and arrests, and as we just heard from Michael, the largest number now of people that are being imprisoned under terms of administrative detention, where there's no trial, not even the pretense of a trial, and can be renewed over and over, leading to years in prison. Then in forced evictions in and outside of occupied East Jerusalem, the expansion of settlements, including these tiny, officially illegal outposts that are deemed illegal even by Israel's own laws, and the apartheid wall that not only separates Palestinians from their own villages and their homes, and aside from separating huge components of the Palestinian population, but also encloses within it the 6 major water aquifers, the 6 major water sources of the West Bank, ensuring the lack of access to sufficient water for agriculture, for human use, for any of those things. So that the history of Palestinian nonviolence being answered with Israeli violence itself, during the first Intifada, with the nonviolent Intifada that was answered by a call from Rabin to break their bones, break the bones of children who dared toss a stone at an armored tank or an armored personnel carrier, killing civilians, including so many children. In Gaza, the Great March of Return, announced from the beginning as a nonviolent march, all within Gaza's own territory. From the time it was announced, months before it began, Israel said, we are going to answer that with bullets. And indeed, they did. They kept their word, were answered, the nonviolent protests answered by sharpshooters, by snipers, leading to hundreds killed, hundreds more with such severe injuries that it led to amputations of arms and legs, a whole generation of young activists in Gaza that were forced to have their limbs amputated because the hospitals had never been allowed to rebuild, so they could have done the surgery that might have protected their injured limbs. And then you have the criminalization of the nonviolent BDS movement, the nonviolent human rights movements. What we're seeing right now with that escalation that Michael spoke about, where you have organizations devoted to the human rights of Palestinians being criminalized and shut down, with efforts, massive efforts that so far are failing because there's no evidence by the Israelis to convince Europeans and others not to engage with these organizations, not to support them, to which the Europeans are saying, sorry, there's no there. We're not going to end our support because there's no reason to. You've given us no evidence. Even the CIA acknowledged that there was no evidence in what Israel had provided to justify listing these organizations as so-called supporters of terrorism. So you have this ongoing effort to answer nonviolent protests with violence, the weaponization of anti-Semitism as a toxic charge, as a very dangerous charge that's used against Palestinians and used against supporters of Palestinian rights all around the world to undermine the ability to do so, to undermine the ability to mobilize nonviolent protests. Now, most importantly, these Israeli actions don't happen on their own. They are enabled and armed and financed by the United States. The way the media covers them, which is massively changing, I would assert. It has a very long way to go. But if we compare today's media to 10 years ago, it is profoundly different because of the role of the movement for Palestinian rights in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere. And you have a situation where the media reflects the policies of the government in the countries in which they work, most particularly here in the United States. And that is also changing. So the US policy today, that is the policy of having the US embassy in Jerusalem, the annexation of the Golan Heights being okay, that the settlements are legal, all of these very extremist shifts that were announced by the Trump administration, to which the Biden administration did not agree. Joe Biden has made perfectly clear he doesn't agree with them, but it doesn't matter what he agrees with or not. He has not changed the policies, and therefore they have to be accountable to him. These are now Biden policies. Whether or not he agrees with how they came about or the essence of them, they are his policies. And in his last trip to the region, he made clear that there would be no consequence for these Israeli violations, not only of international law, as we heard from Michael, but also violations of US law, the Leahy Act, the Arms Export Control Act, US laws that prohibit precisely what Israel is doing with US supplied weapons. The United States taxpayers are paying 20% of the Israeli military budget, $3.8 billion a year, 20%, actually it's a little more than 20%. That gives us some obligation to have something to say about how those weapons are used, and we have laws that determine that. Israel is in complete violation of that, and yet there is no accountability, not even investigations, whether it's the killing of Shireen, whether it's the collective punishment and in the context of death of numbers of civilians and children in Gaza. So in these contexts, the lack of accountability means that the United States must be held accountable for Israeli violations. That the problem is this protection provided by the United States. Now, I do want to talk for just a second, and then I'm going to wrap up, about the kinds of changes we have seen. The changes in public discourse are enormous. Recent polls indicate things like, just snapshots, 25% of American Jews believe that Israel is an apartheid state. And the fact that the most influential human rights organizations that operate globally, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, have all come out with strong, powerful analyses of how Israeli policies constitute violations of the International Covenant Against Apartheid, has meant nothing in terms of changing US policy. But now we're seeing even some shifts in the media. We saw a great deal of coverage of the apartheid issue when those reports came out. And we're even seeing the just beginnings, just the glimmerings of some shifts at the policy level, in the policy discourse. So in the 2021 Israeli assault on Gaza, there were 12 Jewish House members, self-identified Jewish Democrats, who sent a letter to Biden challenging his refusal to call for an immediate ceasefire. 25 senators did the same thing. And perhaps most significant, 500 former staff members of Biden's own campaign organization, the people who got him elected, 500 of them signed a very powerful letter that spoke of the legacy of Israeli ethnic cleansing against the Palestinians, and again called for an immediate ceasefire. That has never happened. Along with the few individual members of Congress who are themselves actual supporters of Palestinian rights, this broader shift among those who don't, in fact, support Palestinian rights, and yet are feeling compelled, because of these shifts in public discourse, to come out and demand, in this case, a ceasefire. We have a very long way to go. We saw it, and I'll finish with this, in terms of the media coverage of Biden's trip to the region. We saw, appropriately, enormous coverage and outraged coverage of Biden's trip to Saudi Arabia, his fist bump with MBS, the person deemed responsible for the murder of Khashoggi, and crucially, for the assault, the collective punishment in the form of the war being waged against the people of Yemen. There was outrage at that. There was almost nothing in the media except dutiful coverage when the day it happened, but with no analysis, no outrage about his trip to Israel, in which he got off the plane, was welcomed with a demonstration of US weapons, and announced that I feel like I've come home, making clear there would be no accountability. This is the goal we have to have, is to change that reality so that the shift in political discourse and the shift in the media is translated to a shift in policy. And we have no more of this presidents feeling like they are coming home when they arrive in Tel Aviv. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phyllis. Beautifully put. And I think your focus on the US is absolutely the right one. I believe our next speaker, Adam Shapiro, will tell us more about the US relation to Israel.
Thank you, Joe. Just one quick point of correction. In my introduction, I was introduced in my previous position at Frontline Defenders. And my current position where I am is with the Democracy for the Arab World now as Advocacy Director on Israel-Palestine. So just to correct that for the audience. But indeed, in my previous role at Frontline, one of the last things I did do was work to expose and report the use of Pegasus spyware on Palestinian civil society organizations and activists. So even as I transitioned, we're still working on that. Indeed, I'm going to follow up very closely on what Phyllis said, and apologies for any duplication. And of course, I too am honored to be part of this event and with my distinguished colleagues on the panel, and grateful for them for their contributions. I think it's worth stating at the outset and just reiterating that, following up on Phyllis's last point, that the current president we have in the United States, Joe Biden, not Donald Trump, is the one who's on record as saying a long time ago that he considers himself a Zionist. And he has repeated this, and that perhaps explains why he made the statement he did upon arriving in Tel Aviv. But according to officials that I've spoken to in the State Department, including at very senior levels, who have experience working with other administrations, they're telling us, off the record, at least in civil society here, that it is true that this president and his Secretary of State are probably two of the most Zionist people to have in these positions in history of the United States, which is saying something. Now, that is a huge obstacle to face when it comes to changing policy at the moment, but it doesn't mean that there aren't things that are happening, and they're happening in various ways. But what I'm going to first do is lay out kind of the U.S. defense of Israeli actions and crimes is something that we have to understand, I think, more than just at the presidential level, and understand how it operates across the entire spectrum here in the United States. In part because those groups and organizations and funders that are out there that are supporting Israel and working tirelessly to do so are doing so at multiple levels, not just at the highest level. And so if we're going to understand how it operates here and understand how we can move towards a system of accountability and justice, I think it's worth understanding the entirety of it. And I don't expect that everything I will cover will be comprehensive, but at least it'll give an idea. So of course we have the direct kind of support for Israel and defense of its crimes. The most egregious example that we can give is the case of Shireen Abu Akleh, where despite the abundance of evidence that has been presented by, I think at last count, it's 3 media organizations, international media organizations, a human rights organization, including an Israeli human rights organizations, and the United Nations Human Rights Office that's on the ground in the territories, all concluding basically the same thing. And even by Israel's initial own admissions as to who the perpetrator was, what we found the United States doing and the administration doing is basically taking itself to absurdist positions and contorting itself in such a way as to try to ignore the evidence that was out there and make the issue about something, in this case, the bullet or the bullet casing, perhaps, that was a non-starter of an issue entirely. The reason why the United States, I think, grabbed onto this point about the bullet was because it became the point of contention between the Palestinian Authority and Israel. And it was a way for the United States to take not even a position, but to argue a point that left it somehow in this kind of frame of, oh, well, there's a dispute between 2 sides and we're just trying to mediate. Well, that's really not what was important and not what was relevant. And so we ended up in a situation where the United States is still officially asking Israel for its final determination, but where the opportunity for accountability, the very clear and obvious mechanism that the United States can use, which is to order an FBI investigation into the killing of an American citizen, is something that this administration continues to refuse to do, despite the fact that there is now actually overwhelming congressional support for that, including from senators and including from Republican senators. So you actually have an issue now with bipartisan support for an action that the US has within its remit to take very easily and quite frankly, unexceptional in a lot of ways. The FBI doesn't investigate the killing of American citizens abroad. It has investigated the killing of a journalist abroad, Daniel Pearl, in Pakistan years ago when he was first abducted and then ultimately executed, in a country where you had a government that was, at the time at least, in some ways, an ally of the United States in prosecuting the war in Afghanistan. So this is creating yet another exception. We always hear about from the Israeli side how the complaint that Israel is being made an exception. And what the truth is that Israel both makes itself an exception and the United States goes to great pains to exceptionalize Israel from any other kinds of accountability mechanisms, et cetera, that are available to it and that it uses in other places. The other main area, a key area that we have to understand, and it's a relatively recent development, is the United States official adoption as policy of the AOHR, International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism. And more than just simply like the discursive elements of that, this has become official policy for the United States in terms of what is the definition of anti-Semitism. And included in that is the consideration that basically any critique of Israel is effectively anti-Semitism. And so we have a United States ambassador who's been appointed to this role, the global czar on anti-Semitism effectively. And she is going around and making statements and calling out countries for their positions And interestingly, in recent, just before President Biden's trip, she praised Saudi Arabia and the UAE for their efforts because of their participation in dialogue and engagement with Israel, even as both countries continue to persecute religious minorities in their countries. And so we see an insane amount of duplicity and just utter incoherence when it comes to how the assessment is being made of what is anti-Semitic and what is not, and that has very important, considerations in terms of U.S. foreign policy. But the administration is also involved with other means of sort of exerting pressure on the international system to ensure that there isn't any kind of accountability for Israel. One of the most important things that has happened in the international system is the creation of the Commission of Inquiry on Palestine, which has an open mandate and is meant to look at the roots of the conflict, the roots of the situation, and to report and to consider everything from the settlement building, the refugee situation, apartheid laws, all those kinds of things. Well, Secretary of State Blinken, in his first speech at the United Nations Human Rights Council, made it clear that one of the top 3 priorities for the United States with the UN Human Rights Council would be to end the Commission of Inquiry. And he, his quote that he said at the time was that, calling this commission outrageous, other kinds of terminology, and he called it a stain on the council's credibility, which is really an extraordinary use of rhetoric. But what we have seen is that has triggered actions in the United States Congress. It has triggered other types of signal to other ambassadors within the US system to use any opportunity to go ahead and attack the Commission of Inquiry. Most recently, and tying back to the previous point about anti-Semitism, attacks on one of the commissioners for statements he made in an interview, which were not by any measure anti-Semitic, but yet are being framed as such because of the use of this definition as policy by the United States government, and is yet a way to attack the Commission of Inquiry. This follows on years of the United States making life difficult, trying to intercede with the work of the International Criminal Court. And that court's efforts to try to look at the question of Palestine and potential accountability issues related to Israel's conduct in Gaza, not just Israel, by the way. The ICC is actually also looking at Palestinian actors as well. So that case is looking at all potential crimes, but the focus, of course, is to not have the ICC look at Israel. Just on a point about that, the new prosecutor at the ICC, who took over, I think, last year, was quiet during the recent attacks on Gaza. And that silence was noted around the world because it was in stark contrast to other statements he has made and other positions he has taken, particularly in relation to what Russia is doing in Ukraine. And I think this is now kind of the event in the world of what's going on with what Russia is doing in Ukraine that reminds the world and reminds everyone of the double standard that exists. We have seen international mechanisms, we have seen the United States even move to support accountability and accountability mechanisms when it comes to Ukraine in perhaps unprecedented speed. And yet we can't even have a commission from the United Nations ask questions and collect evidence about what's happening in Israel or what's happening to Palestine. I should also point out that the United States was also one of the first countries the Secretary of State, in fact, was one of the first countries to quickly respond to the latest UN human rights report on China, which came out just about a day ago, and praised that report and praised the work that the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights did on documenting genocide in China, and didn't bother to worry about if China was being singled out in any way. It didn't bother to worry about how China was being treated by the international community. Yet when the same office and the High Commissioner herself pointed out that UN human rights officials working in Palestine cannot get their visas renewed, and that human rights workers have been kicked out of the country, multiple US ambassadors, including the US ambassador to the United Nations Human Rights Council, criticized the High Commissioner, and again used that opportunity to reiterate the points about anti-Semitism targeting the Commission of Inquiry. So this is kind of the way that the United States is exerting pressure in the international system and trying to shape the discourse and shape how things are done, even when it's not acting directly to defend Israel. I'll quickly get to three other spaces where there is defense of Israel going on. One is in Congress, and Phyllis referred to a couple of laws that the United States has on the books regarding military sales and the use of US weaponry. And it's not just the administration that has a responsibility on that. Congress has an oversight responsibility. And I know we'll hear from our former Congressman Jim Moran, I believe, on this call. But it should be noted that the mechanisms that exist for oversight when it comes to US weaponry, US weapon sales and US military support, it is impossible to get, particularly the Senate, to use its power to have oversight in this way. And this is an area where there will have to be effectively almost an overturning of who is in the Senate and who is in Congress almost completely in order to move that body to exert its power. When it does, when the Congress chooses to use its oversight responsibility, we have seen tremendous results, including at times with how the Saudis have been supported in terms of conducting its campaign in Yemen. That's been one of the most significant areas of pressure on the administration to stop its support or to curtail its support to Saudi Arabia, has come from congressional oversight in regards to weapon sales and support for Saudi Arabia. So it's a powerful tool, it's out there, and it's something that Congress could use even without harming the overall US-Israeli relationship. The other thing that's happening is that there are efforts to create legislation to shield Israel from any forms of accountability and to also to impose penalties on anyone trying to support Palestine through nonviolent means, including with the efforts both at the federal level, which haven't been successful yet, but at the state level, more importantly, to criminalize BDS activity and increasingly to use the anti-Semitic definition of AOHR to then condition speech that we as American citizens are supposed to have freedom to. And so that takes us to the state level. You know, among the 50 states in the United States, the way it works, each state has it designs and creates its own laws at the state level. And there has been an effort to use a copy-paste method to introduce anti-BDS legislation, which has been successfully introduced in a number of states, but thankfully at this point has been challenged in courts and largely has been overturned, although that hasn't stopped it. And so basically what we're seeing is now round two, where the deployment of the anti-Semitic AOHR definition is being used to boost anti-BDS legislative efforts in what is, a 2.0 version of this legislation. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is more and more states and more state attorney generals being willing to use this tool, because increasingly what we're finding is that the tobacco industry, the oil and gas industry, and other sectors, coal mining, coal industry, find the anti-BDS legislative efforts useful for their own efforts to stop climate change activists from holding companies accountable in those spheres. So there's an intersectionality in a very negative way that's going on there. And then finally, just to say, in the sort of private space, the non-governmental space, we've seen three areas where efforts to preserve Israel and shield it from any kind of critique or criticism or accountability have occurred. One is with elections, the unprecedented support of financial contributions to campaigns and to support candidates whose allegiance to Israel and to pro-Israeli forces in the United States are unquestioned, including increasingly support to anti-democratic candidates in the United States, those who are part of the right-wing efforts to undermine our elections and to call into question the validity of elections. On college campuses, where this has been going on actually for a longer period of time, to single out university professors, student groups, et cetera, to stop any kind of honest and critique of Israel in various ways, including in the kinds of courses that are taught, the kind of materials that are used, and the kind of student activities that are organized. And then finally, and in some ways, very significantly, is the advent of a new kind of effort to look there's an organization in the US called J-Lens, which is meant to look at investing and private, mutual funds and other kinds of investment mechanisms in private companies and in businesses and mutual funds to see if there's any, what they're doing on paper is to see if there's any anti-Semitism involved in the investment decisions being made. What it is effectively an anti-BDS effort to basically try to find companies and then leverage all kinds of pressure on them, investment companies, if they use business and human rights principles to make investing decisions. If you apply business and human rights principles, then businesses that are operating in the West Bank, businesses that are providing support to or business with Israeli military, those would get weeded out and those wouldn't be available for investment by pension funds, by other kinds of investment tools. What the effort is basically to effectively criminalize the use of business and human rights standards if Israel is included in that. So either what they want is to not include Israel or Israel's actions at all in these investment decision-making, or again, in a very bizarre intersectional sort of effort led by oil and gas companies, especially, to also have the same kind of application made to their activities as well. So this becomes not just about Israel, but it gets wrapped in all kinds of conservative, counter-progressive causes and causes that are harmful, not just to Palestinians, but to a much wider section of society, not just in the United States, but globally. So this is kind of the way things are operating to defend Israel, to shield Israel globally, and particularly here in the United States. And again, as Phyllis mentioned, and I don't want to get too much into this, but there is pushback. We are successful in a lot of ways, and that's why we're seeing these efforts escalate against what we're doing, but we're still fighting an incredibly uphill battle. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much for that, Adam. Really very thorough. I've written a page of notes. Those of us in Britain who are for the rights of the Palestinian people and against anti-Semitism have found that the AOHR definition that you mentioned indeed does have numerous harmful political effects. And for those of you that aren't familiar with it, there is a definition presented in the Jerusalem Declaration that is explicitly presenting an alternative to the AOHR definition that's less harmful to those struggling in and with Palestine. And I'll post a link to it in the comments. Our next speaker is Jim Moran. We've heard a lot about the US House and Senate. Jim was.
Excuse me, if I may, please. I apologize. I sent you a message. I really have to be at the Friday prayer, and I have to leave in about 20 minutes. And I sent you a private message, but I know as you're hosting, you did not see it. And I apologize for having to leave, but it is Friday, and I have to go to the Friday prayer. If it is possible for me to present, I would appreciate it.
I'm sure everyone understands. Please, Khalid Tarani, have the floor.
Okay. Once again, I apologize from the other speaker who was supposed to speak. Basically, I mean, I want to start by saluting Khalil Awad, a Palestinian who has endured 172 days of hunger strike, protesting his unlawful detention. Khalil Awad, for those who don't know him, was born in 1982. He has spent 12 years of his life in Israeli prisons. 6 of those 12 years were in administrative detention. Administrative detention means the Israelis can put you in jail and not charge you with any crime, hold you in prison indefinitely for 6 months at a time. That can be renewed. I see with us, by the way, former Congressman Jim Moran. Greetings to you, sir. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for the opportunity. So Khalil Awad spent all this time in a hunger strike, 172 days. I mean, really came that close to dying. If it was not Israel who was holding Khalil Awad, and if Khalil Awad was not Palestinian, he would have been celebrated all over the world for his heroic stands firm on justice. But it is Israel, and unfortunately, in a Western context, we have to give Israel a pass. This is really shameful. What I wanted to talk about is the Israeli matrix of apartheid. Israeli apartheid is very unique, that it is, I mean, a lot of times we address specific actions that the Israelis are doing in perpetrating apartheid against the Palestinian. But if we put it all in one, in kind of tie it together, these different practices, I mean, we talk about home demolition, and we say this is apartheid. And then we talk about confiscation of Palestinian land, and then we say, well, this is an Israeli apartheid. But I think trying to put it together as a matrix of apartheid, it is an entire regime that really support different aspects of that apartheid regime. I think we kind of get to see the fuller picture of how Palestinians are suffering under that Israeli apartheid. For example, that 7% in Jerusalem, as maybe a microcosm of that apartheid. In Jerusalem, the Israelis express their desire, express their policies openly, they don't try to hide it, that we must keep a balance of population balance. We don't want more Palestinians in Jerusalem. It has to be at maximum 40% Palestinians. The balance has always to be in favor of the Jewish population. So in order for them to achieve that, they do home demolition, they do land confiscation, they make it very difficult for Palestinians to run their businesses through an apartheid-like regime of arnuna or taxes on buildings and on businesses. But also the Israelis issue only 7% of the building permits in Jerusalem are issued to Palestinians, who are near 50% of the population. The Israelis wanted to push that percentage to 40%, but even at 50% of the population, Palestinians get 7% of the building permits. Israeli Jews get 93% of the building permit. So that is one way the Israelis can perpetrate and can execute their apartheid system on the Palestinians. The demolition of entire communities, like in the Negev desert. So when it is occupied territory, it is one thing, but when it is Israeli citizens who are being discriminated against in a very methodical and systemic kind of way, that really makes it very pronounced and very clear apartheid. So they demolish a Palestinian village of Bedouins in the Negev desert. Those are Israeli citizens. They demolish their village many times. Like they go 10 times and they destroy the village. The Palestinians rebuild, in like tents and cardboard houses and just very rudimentary buildings to live in, to keep them from the sun in the summer and from rain in the winter, and the Israelis will destroy it. They destroy it 10 times, then 20 times, then 30 times, then 40 times, determined to really drive those Palestinians out of their villages. This is in the areas occupied by Israel in 1948, that is in the Negev desert. But then in Al-Khalil or Hebron, in the West Bank, they go to Musafir Yatta, another Bedouin village that has been there for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they destroy the entire village for driving those Palestinians out, and they pitch, the Palestinians will pitch tents and try to stay in their land and in their village. This is another thing. Another part of that matrix of apartheid is trying to close down the Palestinian human rights organization. So we do the home demolition, we do the land confiscation, and then we try to close down the Palestinian human rights organizations that are defending those who are the victims of the Israeli apartheid. This is another part of that matrix. Another part of the matrix is making sure that Palestinians' life is as miserable as it can be. Well, we know that Palestinians depend heavily on their crops, whether it is olives or the fig trees or the pomegranate. And so Palestinians are peasant society for the most part outside of the cities. So the Israeli settlers, under the protection of the Israeli military, go, and when it is time to harvest the olive crops, the Israelis go and then they burn the olive trees, they steal the crops, they assault the Palestinian farmers as they're trying to collect their olive crops, making it, I mean, a Palestinian farmer waits all year for the time when it is time to harvest the olive crops. And when they are just reaching that point of harvesting their crop, the Israelis come, either they burn the trees, steal the crops, or assault the villagers and make it really difficult for the Palestinians to gain really the financial benefits of their land, you know, the land of milk and honey, as you'd know, in a biblical context. Now, another part of that matrix is using the Israeli courts. So, for example, in Masafer Yatta, the Palestinian village near Hebron, where the entire village is being destroyed, you go to the Israeli Supreme Court, and the Israeli Supreme Courts happen to agree with the Israeli military, and they say, well, yeah, that village have got to be destroyed. To me, it reminds me that you know, during slavery in the United States, you go to the court saying, you know, a slave will go to the court say, you know, they shouldn't buy me and sell me. I am a human being. And then the Supreme Court or the courts, and you know, with those judges, respectable judges with their robes and their doctorate from the Sorbonne or from whatever university they graduated, come and with a straight face tell that slave, no, they have the right to enslave you. Or a judge in apartheid South Africa will go to a native in South Africa and say, well, you happen to be half of a human being, so because of that, you shouldn't ride the bus with the white people, or you know, whatever ruling that those judges are making. The same thing is happening in 2022, where an Israeli judge who probably graduated from Columbia University migrated to make Aliyah to Israel and became a judge there, and that educated person with doctorate in jurisdiction, JD degree in law, doctorate in law, and would sit there and will tell a Palestinian, well, yeah, I understand, but the law says that we have to destroy your village because the Israeli military confiscated your village. That kind of matrix of control, matrix of apartheid, make life extremely difficult for the Palestinians. But despite all of that, I see Palestinians continue to be resilient. The Palestinians' resistance in their own land is being met, unfortunately, in the West with acquiescence to the Israeli apartheid, standing down, really, if you will, for the Israelis' support, and as the other speakers have said, continuing to support the Israeli through military means, through shielding Israel from its action against the Palestinians, just like what happened in South Africa. South Africa could not have continued to be the apartheid regime that it was without the US and the British, as well as the European support of that apartheid regime under all kind of pretense, calling the the National Congress calling them terrorist groups and finding all kind of excuses for the apartheid regime in South Africa. We see that happening all over again now with Israel and with the Palestinians. It is high time for the West to stop supporting the apartheid regime and not to repeat history all over again and waiting until more Palestinians are going to be killed and more suffering for the Palestinians before the West stop its supports. Without the West standing really between the Palestinians and the Israelis, supporting on the side of the Israelis, Israel cannot continue to be the apartheid regime that it is, and I think the West have got to stop. I'm sorry, maybe I've gone a little over time, and I apologize for speaking out of turn, but you understand it is Friday. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Khalid, and apologies on behalf of the AOHR UK for not scheduling in a way that would mean it would be convenient.
Right.
Jim, please.
Yes.
After you.
Can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Are we all set?
Yes, indeed.
We are, okay. Well, so we've heard from people who are knowledgeable, thoughtful, who have, most importantly, have intellectual and moral courage. And what we're dealing with is a lack of those things, a lack of knowledge, of thoughtfulness, of really intellectual and moral courage on the part of the leaders that should be able to use the power of the United States to rectify this injustice. I don't see it happening. What has been portrayed, and it's awfully nice to be on the panel with these individuals. It's good to see Phyllis again.
Jim, I'm sorry to interrupt. I think you might have tapped the mute button by mistake. Oh, perhaps you're covering the microphone somehow. We can hear you, but very faintly.
Well,
you came in and then we lost you again.
Okay. Can you hear me better now?
Yes, you can. Loud and clear.
All right. Well, you didn't miss anything. I was just saying that the previous speakers have spoken the truth. What they have said is all provable. It's available to people who want to know the facts on the ground in the West Bank and Gaza. But very few people know those facts. And even fewer people have the courage to do something about it. So what you've heard about is an indictment of the current Israeli government, but especially of the United States, because it is the United States that enabled Israel's founding in the first place, and has in fact funded and armed the Israeli government for now about 75 years. The United States ought not make any pretensions of being fair-minded, because it hasn't been. And that's a reflection of domestic policies within the United States, politics. It's not policies, excuse me, it's domestic politics. The fact is that there is limited Palestinian political support in the United States, and there's overwhelming pro-Israel organization support and funding of the American political establishment. And I'm afraid it could well get worse. What happened recently is very troubling. 7 Democrats were defeated in primaries. You've got a person like Andy Levin, who would have been a terrific lawmaker from Michigan. His father and his uncle were iconic politicians within the Democratic Party, but because he had the moral and intellectual courage to speak out as to what was right and fair with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian struggle, they defeated him. They beat him. They put in millions of dollars to defeat him. Likewise in Maryland, Donna Edwards, who had spoken out for fair-minded treatment of the Palestinians, she was defeated as well. To people who were given very substantial, maxed contributions from AIPAC and AIPAC-related people and organizations. So that was an intimidating factor that I think is going to continue within the American political establishment. It is disappointing that President Biden, as far as I'm concerned, has not shown the kind of the equanimity, I'm trying to choose my words carefully because I like Joe personally, and I support him obviously, and obviously against President Trump. But I've been disappointed with the Biden administration, the way that it has dealt with the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and in fact, to some extent, with the Middle East. And I'm sorry that while President Biden has to know the facts, that when he said he feels at home in a land that is increasingly becoming right wing, that has been led for most of the last decade, really, by Bibi Netanyahu, who did everything he could to undermine Barack Obama, particularly because Barack Obama was trying to do the right thing with regard to the Middle East. It is very disappointing. I will say that a large part of the support has come from not just conservative Jewish elements within the American society, but also from Christian evangelical movements, because they take the word of the Old Testament literally. And so they have an uncommon zealous support for Israel. And they have, of course, have been manipulated by the pro-Israel elements in the country. But we should bear in mind some things that were said. It may have been Adam or Phyllis that said it. And these things are also true. That 3/4 of American Jewish people are Democrats, know the reality on the ground, would vote for Democrats who are willing to stand up to the right-wing government in Israel, and they abhor the fact that AIPAC, the largest pro-Israel political organization in the United States, endorsed over 100 Republicans who tried to overturn the 2020 election, claiming that it had been stolen. I'm sure all of you are familiar with that. There is no truth to it whatsoever, obviously, and yet 100 of them were supported. Many of them are people who have supported white supremacist groups, who have called people who were protesting for human rights and so on Nazis and the like. People who subscribe to this replacement theory that whites are being replaced by the other. I have to hold my phone so I can't put in quotation marks, but of course, and that is really the hypocrisy, the most troubling thing that I see in terms of Israel, that the most fundamental principle is that you should be judged by how you treat the other. And if the Palestinians are not the definition of the other in that truism, then I don't know who is. Obviously, they are, and so much of this is just so counter to the original principles that founded Israel. Part of the problem is that Israel is no longer governed really by those who were the beneficiaries of the Enlightenment, of Western European philosophy, of human rights, of rule of law, of equal application of the law to everyone, and so on. It's increasingly governed by the Sephardic Jewish people who feel as though they're under siege and who have not been blessed by the principles of the Enlightenment. So I don't know where we're going to go. The enlightened parts of Israel society don't have much political influence. Many of them try. I read Haaretz, but I know that Haaretz is not the principal influencer of Jewish society. They're putting up the good fight, but I'm afraid they're in the minority. And people who I thought should have been roundly condemned by every Israeli are now in the Knesset and in government. And unfortunately, the money and the political influence that drives American politics has largely been on the side of the pro-Israel elements, even right-wing governments. So I'm discouraged. I'm reluctant even to engage in panels like this because I can't say anything that's particularly optimistic without being somewhat dishonest. And if this Democratic administration is not going to do anything, certainly not a Republican administration, because the Republican administrations are far more likely to support right-wing governments and the Christian evangelical movement within the United States. I appreciate the efforts of Dawn. I appreciate the efforts of J Street. I appreciate people like Peter Beinart and Phyllis Adam and people who know what they're talking about. I appreciate the people on campuses that continue the work of Edward Said, who was influenced a great many people at Columbia. But where Israel stands as an example of our unwillingness to be true to our most basic beliefs that are supposed to define America. So I don't know what to tell, but right now it's the results are not promising.
Thank you so much, Jim. We've 4 more speakers left and 50 minutes. We want a little time for a Q&A, for some discussion. And because of that, if I can ask the following speakers to try and stick to 10 minutes or so, that would be much appreciated. Our next speaker is Sarah Flanders, excuse me. Sarah, please.
Thank you. It's good to participate in this panel. I'm a contributing editor to Workers' World newspaper and a co-director of the International Action Center. For decades, since 1948, Palestinian resistance has been a shining example to all the world of a people who refuse to submit to colonial domination, apartheid conditions, and the most brutal forms of segregation and subjugation. Israel is an apartheid regime between the river to the sea, driven by a settler colonial ideology. And despite conditions of siege, total blockade, displacement, bulldozing homes, That resistance continues. And that's where we need to place our confidence, not in US policy. Not a day of these crimes is possible without 75 years of US arms, equipment, and political and diplomatic support. And we need to name the US role again and again. It's true, Biden, Trump, Bush, Clinton, Democrat or Republican, it continues, that flow of money, of arms, of support. Support for Palestine means support for the right to resist, including defending the right to fire rockets, the right to dig tunnels, the right to organize the people against sure starvation and blockade that Israel has criminally imposed. It includes the right to be represented in parliament and to form elected bodies without imprisonment endlessly. Resistance takes every and many forms, stones to rockets to strikes to sit-ins. It includes defending the right of Palestinians to shape their own media, to tell their own story. It's a Zionist state that assassinates even journalists such as Shireen Abu Akleh. Consider this. Shireen, a veteran correspondent, well-known throughout the Arab world, reporting on an Israeli raid in the West Bank city of Jenin, always a hub of resistance. An Israeli sniper fired a bullet into her face. And even though Shireen was a US citizen, well-respected, internationally known journalist, clearly identified as the media, working for Al Jazeera, the response of the US was silence, long time to look into an investigation, but it was the response of millions, the huge outpouring of outraged Palestinians and many others around the world. It confirms the depth of Palestinian resistance and its place in our hearts. It's not just Shireen. Palestinian journalists have long been subjected to arrests and attacks. At least 30 journalists have been killed by Israeli security forces since 2000. And in addition to assassinations, they face arrests, destruction of equipment, physical attack. 13 Palestinian journalists are held in administrative detention without charges. And I want to say next on administrative detention. Today, to salute Palestinian prisoner Khalil Awadeh, a hunger strike of 182 days, 6 months. Khalil ended the hunger strike after succeeding in winning release from administrative detention without charges or trial. This is a victory over Israeli occupation and colonial imprisonment. Around the world, people marched, demonstrated, tweeted, and took actions to support Khalil Awadeh's resistance and steadfastness. The struggle within the prisons is escalating. 1,000 Palestinian prisoners are scheduled to launch a hunger strike this week in a fight against the increasing Zionist repression in the prisons. Against administrative detention, where orders are issued up to 6 months at a time on the basis of alleged secret evidence, indefinitely renewable. Administrative detention orders are used against community leaders and organizers. There's 700 Palestinians held without charge or trial in occupation prisoners out of 4,500 Palestinian prisoners. 160 children are so held, 32 women. I want to say a word also on the settlement expansion. The bulldozers, so wrecking crews, unrelenting year after year. Bulldozers are sent to destroy schools, clinics, family homes, orchards, to clear land for more and more settlements and annexations. They're carried out by armed IDF soldiers and vigilante mobs. These are war crimes, totally illegal expropriation, despite US support and approval. There's over 240 Israeli settlements and outposts, totally illegal. Every settlement is an act of violence. There's a whole network of Israeli only byroads, absolute apartheid conditions. The entire West Bank carved into numerous tiny pieces, carved by walls, hundreds of IDF checkpoints. Generations of Palestinians grow up under barbed wire, passing through checkpoints, threatened by armed soldiers. Attacks are constant. Now on Gaza, Gaza is the living center of resistance, known throughout the world for its resistance. Conditions in Gaza are desperate. The Zionist policy is to restrict even entry of the most basic food, fuel, electricity, everything, even water pumps, filters, soap, batteries, spare parts, essential medicines, cooking oil, computers, generators, flour. There's rolling blackouts, overwhelming problems of sewage disposal in the most densely populated area of the world, really a concentration camp in every form. Even UN relief supplies cut off, along with remittances. Travel, even for severely sick patients, almost impossible. Yet under impossible conditions, resistance of every form continues, from tunnels to rockets to protests. And within the 48 borders of Israel, the Palestinians living in the 48 borders, labeled Arab Israelis, were subjected to a military government that restricted their movement, expropriated their property, suppressed their political activity. Really, what Israel has attempted to do is fragment the Palestinians through a multi-tiered system of laws, policies, and statutes. Many organizers listening today are involved in the most practical work of mobilizing opposition at the grassroots. Collectively, such organizers have brought millions into the streets in public demonstrations of solidarity. This is true in the Arab and Muslim world, throughout the entire global South, and also in the imperialist countries and in the US. And in some places, blocked and occupied embassies, targeted countries that have collaborated with Israeli war crimes, even taken boats to Gaza, taken up collections of people-to-people humanitarian aid. We have to sustain these movements, the ongoing boycott, divest, sanction movement, including continuing the charges of war crimes charges on all the Israeli leaders, and demanding an accounting from our own government, especially the criminal role of the US government. Palestine has always been an unequal struggle. Resistance takes as many forms as life and conditions dictate, and ways are found to circumvent every onerous condition. There's great ingenuity and enormous determination, and we need to look at this. It will enable us to continue. There's more than 6 million Palestinians living in the global diaspora, and the spirit of resistance and return still burns for them. And they're a real force in this struggle. The unsolvable problem for US imperialism and for Zionism is their inability to defeat the will, the determination of the Palestinian people, who are in a struggle for full self-determination and the right of all Palestinian people to return to their land. Hunger, isolation, and blockade have failed. Repression, mass imprisonment, and torture have failed to break resistance. To today, despite their physical dispersal, the Palestinian people have never been more connected, from the West Bank to Gaza to the 48 borders to the diaspora. It's seen and felt as one struggle. And the empty promises that talk of peace and negotiations are increasingly recognized as just that, empty. This is a population, the Palestinians, with skills, with high levels of education, and yet the massive unemployment, lots of time, and no future will find ways, to endlessly creative ways, to resist. That resistance from Jerusalem to Gaza, from Haifa to Ramallah, from the streets to the prison cells, is where we place our confidence, and it's essential to the world movement to give full support to the Palestinian people and the liberation of all Palestine, from the river to the sea. Thank you.
Thank you. very much for your optimistic counterpoint to Jim Moran's own views. I really appreciate that. If I can explain, one of our speakers, Pauline, is unable to speak. She's been called away, and so the new schedule will be Nadine first, and then last but not least, Ralph Wild, who I'm so sorry, Ralph, I forgot to introduce you in my opening remarks. Ralph Wild is an associate professor of UCL's University of London's Faculty of Laws, and he'll speak on the ICC, I believe. But before him, thanks so much for your patience. Nadine, please, off to you.
Hello, I hope you are hearing me now. All right, we all know that for now, as we heard, everybody speaks almost the facts that we all know, that the media in the United States is not really fair enough to the Palestinian issues. We see that the media changed recently, since 2021, when the violence happened in Al-Quds. Yes, that happened, but that wasn't enough, and we saw the levels went down again to the media to be beside Israeli. All right, this is facts. Now we need to find solutions for this. How? Because the US media is very important to be supportive to the Palestinian in general, not only supporting to the Israeli, which is making it very difficult to make any improvement on the Palestinian issues or deals or anything. Now there is, I'm supporting everything everybody said so far, for sure, but I'm trying to find solutions for that. For example, since I started reporting in the United Nations, I noticed that the Palestinian TV, Palestinian media, which is the land where everything happening, they don't have enough budget to work really on a media to deliver everything happening to the world. This is a very important issue. I think should be more funding happening to this. To any media in Palestine, in Gaza, in West Bank, to deliver every detail about how Palestinian lives comparing to the Israeli, what's the Israeli military and police they are treating the Palestinian, and make it more obvious to the world what's going on in there, because over years the people all over the world start forgetting the story. They are being brainwashed by the Israeli media all over the world, especially by the US media. This is something very harmful for the Palestinian to not be able to deliver their word and their voice clearly to the world every day. Not only occasionally when things happen and get escalated to a big violence, no, but on daily levels. This should be really be brought to the front to let everybody know. That's one thing. The other thing, yes, I know that the Al Jazeera and other news channels, they're working in their behalf, but I believe that's not really enough, because there's daily things happening for their normal life. They don't have human rights. They don't have really political rights. They live on a very minimum, how we say this, they cannot really have a normal life. They cannot cross borders. They cannot go to certain places. They always get arrested. There is violence happening. every day nobody talk about it, unless if it really escalated, then it will be on the news. And when it is on the news, the US media will cover it in a way trying to be fair, but not really fair so far, because even if they have some development and if we saw the changes recently, that how they treated the violence happened in Ramadan in 2021, 2022, but still we can see it clearly that it is not fair enough. All right, will be worse when any election get closer, any US elections get closer to happen. We notice that this change will vanish and we'll go back to the same story, that they are really besides the Israeli power in every way. The political problems and issues that it is very much affected by the Israeli lobby is the most important thing that's happening on the US. That's why there are certain things that it must be done for the Palestinian to be able to be more powerful and to make the Israeli power in political view is really limited as much as we can, to bring the truth and make the whole world knows that this is what's happening. From the story from since Al-Nakba 1948 up to now, there's too many things. Plus the media, the Arab media, Al Jazeera, Al Arabi, all other media also as well. I think should be more documentaries be made on small details, on small things and big things as well. Mainly should be more English speakers like to be interviewed by CNN, for example, to be interviewed on every US media, because US media, they like to interview people who speaks in English, and not so many people in Palestine, they can speak English and explain to the American people whatever they are, their directions at, as still they cannot find enough people speak English. This should be prepared to be more efficient and working in a better way for the American media to help the American media also to deliver the whole picture, to deliver the truth and be fair enough. I think this point, if it's each one needs a lot of effort, it will bring accomplishment all over the world, the road. It will bring some positive to try to solve the issues and have the US decisions, the political views in the support of the Palestinian. I will leave it that way here.
Thank you very much, Nadine, and again, thank you for your patience. Same to Ralph Wild. My mistake, I didn't introduce your topic. Could you've got the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm speaking to you from Sheikh Jarrah in Al-Quds, a few minutes walk from St. Joseph's Hospital, where the attack on the pallbearers of Shirin Abu Akla's coffin took place. When Diana Bhutto was interviewed on the killing, she said that we have to remember that it was only possible because the Israeli soldiers were in Jenin in the first place. In this, of course, she was reminding the world about the illegitimacy of the occupation itself. She was seeking to counter an approach that would focus on particular horrific incidents only, without situating these incidents within the broader context of the occupation, and also understanding that as oppression and violence. I'm an international lawyer, and in my remarks today, I'll explain how international law does speak to the concern Diana Bhutto articulated, but this is commonly ignored. I argue that we have to think differently about the relevance of international law to the situation here. My remarks are based on a short policy brief, which I will post in the chat. which is in turn based on a longer article in the Palestine Yearbook of International Law, which I will also post in the chat. And links to both are also in a pinned tweet on my profile at Ralph Wild. Now, a common and mistaken view is that the question of when the occupation should end is a matter of politics only, not also international law. According to this view, ending the occupation can and will only happen when there's a peace agreement, because there's no international law rule requiring Israel to terminate the occupation, irrespective of whether a peace agreement providing for this has been adopted. So in the absence of an agreement, Israel is somehow entitled to maintain control. And during this period of continued occupation, the supposed utility of international law is only to serve as a basis for addressing particular alleged incidents of violations of individual and collective rights by Israel. Essentially, how ostensibly humane things are under conditions of occupation. And doing this using the rules of international humanitarian law, including occupation law, international human rights law, international criminal law, including the law relating to war crimes and crimes against humanity, and the prohibition of apartheid. And also to prohibit Israel from using its exercise of control to annex any part of the territory affected. Commentators don't tend to invoke international law to address the existence of the authority to occupy itself. This is an entirely mistaken view of international law. It ignores the international legal position that a state is only entitled to control territory that is not its own sovereign territory, and which is the territory of your population grouping who have the right of external self-determination on the basis of the self-defense component of the international law on the use of force. And as the test in the international law on the use of force is not met in this instance, the exercise of control, the existence of the occupation itself, not merely how it is conducted, is illegal. So the existential legitimacy of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, is then a matter of international law, specifically the law of self-determination and the international law on the use of force. Now, the international law of self-determination concerns the right of a people to decide their international status, for example, to constitute themselves as a state, and to be self-governing on this basis, free from the control of another state or states. And the Palestinian people are universally accepted to have this right in international law. The anti-colonial form of external self-determination adopted in international law in the second half of the 20th century, applicable to the Palestinian people, was a repudiation of the concept of trusteeship over people. According to the trusteeship concept, people were ostensibly, potentially to be granted their freedom if and when they were deemed ready by colonial authorities. The post-war self-determination rule, which was the international legal basis for recognizing decolonization, scrapped this approach in favor of an automatic right. The new rule was rooted in the basic entitlement of people to freedom, not readiness. And the right operates regardless of whether the authority depriving the people of their ability to exercise self-rule agrees to relinquish control. Necessarily then, this form of freedom, the end of external control, is to be realized immediately. So in consequence, the Palestinian people are supposed to be immediately freed of the occupation. The occupation is supposed to end straight away because it has no valid legal basis to exist. Put differently, its very existence is illegal. However, a military occupation can be permitted if it's justified according to the international law on the use of force, specifically self-defense. If it's justified on this basis, it would not violate the law of self-determination and could be lawfully maintained. In consequence, the occupation would not be illegal, and would not need to be immediately terminated. The Israeli occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, as a military occupation is, to use the language of international law, a use of force, which is a euphemistic term for war, including military occupation. A use of force is only legally permitted in self-defense. And the use of force in self-defense is only legally permitted if there's an actual or imminent threat. And the use of force involved, here of course a full military occupation, is a necessary and proportionate response to that threat. The occupation here is manifestly outside the scope of what is legally permitted. In consequence, it is an unlawful use of force, an aggression. The very same violation of international law committed by Russia in Ukraine. And it is an egregious violation, given its 55+ year duration. What this means is that the very exercise of authority and control by Israel here is in and of itself illegitimate. It is illegal. Israel has no right to exercise authority here at all. So the way that Israel then exercises this authority, its treatment of the Palestinian people, covered by those other rules of international law I mentioned, such as international humanitarian law, the prohibition of apartheid, is in one important sense a secondary matter, because the authority is in and of itself illegal. So to address the question of whether and when the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, should end as a matter of international law, it's necessary to move beyond the typical exclusive focus on the laws of war, international humanitarian law, including the law of occupation, international criminal law, most of human rights law, the prohibition of apartheid, and the question of annexation. Instead, the focus needs to also be on the law of self-determination and the law on the use of force. So to conclude, all actors, states, officials of international organizations generally, the UN in particular, including the various international human rights mechanisms, other human rights mechanisms such as UN special procedures, mandates holders, the UN Human Rights Council, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, etc., and human rights NGOs and other interested parties who are concerned with the compatibility of the occupation with international law generally and international human rights law in particular, because self-determination is part of human rights law, need to move beyond addressing merely how humane, in inverted commas, the conduct of the occupation is, and making generalized affirmations of self-determination for the Palestinian people. They should affirm that the position that the continuance of the occupation is in and of itself a violation of the international law of self-determination and the international law on the use of force. On this basis, international law requires that the occupation end now. Every day that the occupation continues, regardless of how ostensibly humane its conduct, involves a violation of international law by Israel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ralph. That was the timer, exactly 10 minutes. For providing a proactive measure of the type that I believe Nadine was calling for before you. I'm sorry to say that that's the end of today's session. I want to thank everyone for coming, especially the speakers. We'll have to continue the discussion next time. And so on behalf of AOHR UK, I want to thank you and hope you have a nice weekend. Thanks.